Boardroom Bound, episode 145, Landing and Acclimating to Your First Board Role with Melanie Steiner.
Say I turned 50 and I said I want to get a board seat, and it took about a year and a half before the board seat materialized. And that was a year and a half of sort of intensive work. So everything from building my board bio and all of the requisite collateral to building a networking strategy. It's not just talking to peers, like you have to get out there and talk to other sitting board members and CEOs, and you essentially have to plant a lot of seeds, and you just don't know what's going to bear fruit.
Hello, and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Melanie Steiner. She is a global retail leader and independent board director who has landed her first public company board seat for U.S. Ecology. And she's a world-renowned expert in risk and ESG, and you will hear about that from her career, from being one of the big four firms where she was a leader in that space, to being a chief risk officer at one of the leading retail brands where she covered ESG and a range of other topics. And you'll hear how she built that position of authority and how that translates over into the boardroom. You'll hear what it's like to be a new board member, including during the crazy times of COVID that we've been living through. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Melanie Steiner, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thanks so much, Alexander. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, this is a timely topic, if I can call it that. I would have guessed what we're talking about today was timely a year ago, but even more so after what we've all been living through with COVID and everything else that has just magnified all of your background and expertise that we're going to get into. So thinking about diving into risk and ESG and diversity and digital, all of these things have just become even more at the forefront of the boardroom stuff today. But I want our audience to understand how you develop this position of authority and this background that you're able to bring it into the boardroom space today. So can we begin talking a bit about your career and that trajectory that led to where you are at the moment?
Absolutely, I'd love to. And I always say when people ask me about my career, it's kind of a little bit difficult to replicate because it's been a bit circuitous in some ways. Because I've always been one to really be focused on pursuing my passions, and as trite as that sounds, but really to focus more on experience, et cetera, rather than strictly title and that sort of thing. But if I can start, so right now I'm currently on the board of U.S. Ecology, Inc., and this is a publicly traded company based in Boise, Idaho, and it is a North American leader in environmental services and waste management, where I also chair the Corporate Responsibility and Risk Committee, and I'm a member of the Audit Committee. And I have about a decade of board experience, including public, private, and nonprofit, but U.S. Ecology was my first public company board, and I'm sure we'll get into a little bit how that happened. Right. In terms of operating roles, so I started my career as a lawyer and spent close to a decade doing that, so really focused on commercial and environmental litigation. So that really grounded me in a lot of great skills that helped from a corporate governance perspective. From there, I moved into Big Four consulting and advisory. So I worked for EY for about 6 years in the risk advisory practice, but was also there the market leader for climate change and sustainability services. And when I came in, it was really a very sort of forward-thinking leader who brought me in because they saw my environmental and sustainability skills, and this was back in 06, 07, so sort of before it took off and was making headlines the way it is now, but a really a great leader at EY who's still there. Who really saw that these were emerging skill sets and brought me in for that purpose, understanding that clients were going to start needing assistance in this area. And in conjunction with another individual at the firm, we co-developed in Canada, where I'm based. We co-developed the climate change and sustainability services client-facing practice and really built it up into a great and thriving practice. And then I also was seconded to the U.S. where I assisted in building up the practice there. From there, I moved to PVH, which was my most recent position. And for those who aren't familiar with PVH, it is a Fortune 500 global apparel company, and you'd probably be much more familiar with its brand. So it owns a host of iconic brands, including Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein. And at PVH, I served in a very strategic and broad-based corporate, chief risk officer role, where I was an officer of the company and a member of the senior management team. And in that role, it was a bit of a unique CRO role. At the time, and I managed a range of functions, including all of the risk functions, so enterprise risk management, crisis management, business continuity, as well as internal audit, insurance, and then cybersecurity and digital risk, and all of the ESG, environmental, social governance functions. So it was really a broad host of functions at a time when I think there was a lot of disruption in the retail space, both from a digital perspective and how consumers were buying stuff, as well as ESG and sustainability and how products were being made. So a very interesting time to be in retail from a risk as well as a strategy perspective. And from there, I've really shifted now to more sort of full-time board service.
And when I think about that, I'm sure that sort of C-suite role was a catapult for many things. And I know before you left, that PVH role is when you landed this U.S. ecology role, you're talking about your first public board role. And many people listening to the show are kind of going, that's what I want. Many people sort of cling to that as like, I will have made it once I'm on the board of a public company. Tell us maybe how that came about and what it's been like for you. And clearly we talk about the show a lot. There's a transition from being in the C-suite to being on the board, and what it's been like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And everybody told me that too, and it really is true. It's so different being, in the trenches as management and then being, on a board where it's really guidance and oversight. So it's just a completely different role, but very interesting and complementary in a lot of ways. And so when I was still in my operating role, I had made it a goal, as I think many people do. I set it for myself, and here I'm going to, give away my age, but I said when I turn 50, I want to expand my purview and my skill set and be of service in a different way through getting a public company board role. And I felt comfortable that I wanted to do this for a number of reasons. I felt, I had a very senior role in a company, and I felt this could be for my own personal development, I think great to take on a board role, which I think could really add value to my own skill set. But at the same time, I also realized that I had a lot of skills that I thought could be of service to boards in a time of extreme disruption and volatility. So, my background in ESG, I think also being in retail at a time when digital was really sort of upending the whole industry, if you will. And so all of this was really coming into play, and I've always been very transformational by nature. And so I decided I really wanted to get a board role. But I think, I've been to a lot of conferences, and especially, women's conferences where, when you ask the question, who wants a paid board role, everyone puts their hand up, but right. It's not so simple. It's almost like I say to some people, it's like a second full-time job. Unless if you are a sitting CEO or retired CEO or CFO with sort of the more traditional skill sets, it's somewhat easier, but I think if you're not in a very sort of well understood lane for board service or something a little out of the norm, like a CRO, it's harder, and you have to really put a lot of time in, boots on the ground, and also be ready for the long game. By which I mean that, let's say I turned 50 and I said I want to get a board seat, and it took about a year and a half before the board seat materialized. And that was a year and a half of sort of intensive work. So everything from, building my board bio and all of the requisite collateral that goes with it, and I could talk for hours about that, to sort of building a networking strategy. And by that, I mean, it's not just talking to peers. Like, you have to get out there and talk to other sitting board members and CEOs and, board of director, board recruiters, because there's sort of a select group of those. So I think really building the right networking, because like I always say, you essentially have to plant a lot of seeds, and you just don't know what's going to bear fruit. And so, I did that. And in point of fact, the way that I got my current board seat was through a connection that wasn't as strong as some of my other ones. It was somebody who I knew, but not exceptionally well. And he's turned out to be a great friend now and colleague, but at the time, didn't know him too well. But it was just through sort of this intensive networking in conjunction with all of these other things I did, like the building the collateral and joining key organizations, et cetera. And I had a spreadsheet, and I really treated it very seriously.
And you were hinting about this earlier in the show, where it sounds like you're a professional board member now is the way I would describe it, and eventually you'll probably have this large portfolio of board work that you're doing. So translate what you've said already about all the best practice stuff that you did to land, say, that first major seat in a public board company. Does anything change for you going forward as you potentially seek more of these, or is it just doing more of the same and doubling down?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. So I think you do have to do more of the same. So the networking doesn't end. And when I left PVH, I must have had in the span of 3 months, a couple of hundred conversations, through Zoom and whatnot. So it doesn't change. I think you have to maintain your connections and also your own, education, and stay up to date with everything. And so I know that that's extremely important. But at the same time, once you land your first seat, it just changes, because you're now in a bunch of you're in a bunch of directories, so you're sort of a known entity, and you will come up periodically, because it's, you have to somehow find your way to the board role, and that can be through search firms, and now that the search firm knows you and knows that you're on a board, you'll be in their database, right? And so I think that it does get a little easier, which is why you will sometimes see that, especially I think you'll see this with some diversity candidates, because sometimes they're harder to find. They'll quickly become overboarded because they'll just be getting calls every week. So once you're known, it does get easier over time, I would say.
Now, I would argue a big part of your calling card, and you can tell us about this, you were talking about your board bio before, is that wide range of responsibilities, the way you described it at PVH for the CRO. I don't think I've ever seen a job description for a CRO that quite covered so much ground, which is really interesting, and it's very fertile given these days about how much is going on. So even if we think about your role today, where you are chairing the Risk and Corporate Responsibility Committee, that I imagine is very different than, say, some of the equivalent types at other boards, because where someone puts ESG can fit very differently. The risk experience can be different from different industries. Perhaps give a sense for someone who's got a bit of this background, how that translates across and how to best explain what they do so someone can see the value add.
Yeah, good question. And I'll say this is really tough, and I got a lot of advice, and a lot of varied advice. So the first thing, when you're building your board bio, the one thing that I was told, which I think is good advice, is you need to be very clear on who you are, because it's your elevator pitch or your value prop, right? And so it's like, what are your 3 to 5 sort of differentiators, if you will? So, but in terms of the advice I got, there were a lot of people saying there's too much in here, or you're too broad. You have to be more focused. I got a number of. I remember my very first call with a board recruiter was a terrible call, and I was very dejected. I think in the end they're like, oh, you're just sort of like a supercharged, general counsel, which is exactly what I'm not, right? I'm almost, like the way I sometimes say it is I'm almost a mini CEO in a sense, because a really good chief risk officer is horizontal across the entire enterprise and needs to know everything that's kind of going on, especially in a time of disruption where your key risks are strategic risks, right? So you have to really understand the strategy and what the mitigants to that are. I didn't do a great job of explaining myself to this recruiter, but also the recruiter was very much of the opinion, like, be much more narrow, like you're just too all over the place. And in the end, I must have rewritten my board bio. I don't even want to say how many times. It could be a little embarrassing, and even to this day, I still revamp it slightly, and I keep it as up to date as possible, as my experience changes. But I'll say that you have to sort of listen to your gut. So I know myself, and I know that my skill set is that to some extent I'm a generalist with strong verticals in certain areas. So ESG, for instance, is a very strong vertical, and something for which I'm globally recognized. And so I kind of went at it with, I have all of these general skill sets, but then I can also add value in these areas. And as it turns out, I think that was, for me, the right thing, and it was. I would say to the listeners, it's good advice because boards tend to, even though we sort of need some next gen skill sets like ESG, and we need some next-gen skill sets in cybersecurity and digital, et cetera. The reality is boards have a lot of topics they have to cover, and there's only so many board seats, and it's hard to give up a seat to like a very narrow topic, if you will. And so realistically, having sort of, as someone once said to me, the big G, generalist plus, then you've really got something to offer. So I think that's how I went about it, and I think that's a good thing. But people, at the end of the day, should kind of know what they're bringing to the table and make it as clear as possible. I don't think you have to narrow yourself, but I think it needs to be clear so people know what they're going to get from you.
Melanie, that makes sense because boards are always looking for a specific candidate. There is a spec, whether it's publicly posted or not, that they have a sense of this is the type of person that we want, and obviously fit might trump everything with the final round of candidates. But let's come back to ESG. You were talking about that before, a big area of focus for you, a big part of your calling card. ESG means different things to different people. Maybe it means something different for all of us after the last year of what we've witnessed and what we've gone through. Help us understand what that means and how an organization thinks about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard because it's definitionally it varies, and I can tell you from the various companies that I worked with at EY to PVH to my current board at US Ecology, it's just different all the way around, and I think it can certainly vary by company and clearly by sector. But I think at the end of the day, it's extremely broad. If you look at all of the environmental issues, all of the social issues, and then you add all of the governance issues, it can almost fit into any and all of the board topics and committee topics, right? So it can be as broad as thinking about, how is this affecting the company's compensation strategy for comp committee? How is this affecting, our governance from a governance perspective, and from an audit perspective, certainly data and the sufficiency of data can be a topic, and how you're reporting. So it's extremely complicated, and I think one of the things that you need to sort of focus on at the beginning. But I could say that there's certain topics that are obviously more important than others, and I can get into detail if you'd like. But right now, obviously, climate change from an environmental perspective has just gained an incredible amount of momentum, as has diversity and inclusion, as well as human capital management. So I think those two topics are ones that many companies are sort of prioritizing from an ESG perspective. And specifically, if you think about climate change, so on March 4th of this year, the SEC announced the creation of a climate and ESG task force because of the increasing investor focus. And the initial focus of this task task force is going to be to identify any material gaps or misstatements in issuers' disclosure of climate risks. So I think this is going to force much more detailed disclosures, and with that, obviously, corresponding strategies. So what are the specific risks and impacts? And I think also thanks to a lot of the endorsement of a lot of larger institutions like BlackRock and Vanguard, et cetera, we're going to continue to see support for climate-related shareholder proposals. So I think we're just going to continue to see a real focus on climate change, on strategies around reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, even from all companies. So that's going to be key. And then on the diversity and inclusion front, I think we're going to really start seeing we have seen a tipping point there. So a lot of enhancement of disclosure around that and your EEO data as a company, and then you're going to start seeing just more diversity in general. I would think both inside companies as well as on boards. I mean, I'm seeing it now.
There's a lot to unpack there. So let's take one piece at a time for some of these. So imagine some of our listeners, even people who are on boards today, haven't done as much thinking about ESG because there's been so many, say, pressing issues during this crisis. There's been a lot to try and manage and wrap their head around. And I imagine any organization that wasn't perhaps as focused on ESG before this crisis thinking, okay, well, we need to be addressing this. We need to be doing it well. If you had an organization, Melanie, let's say that was starting from scratch or putting their first board together, where do you think ESG should sit and where would it be best covered?
So again, I've seen it in a lot of different places. At PVH, there was a corporate responsibility committee of the board that had preceded me, so that was great. There was a history, and I think it was very well established. And obviously, it got more sophisticated over time as the corporate strategy got more sophisticated, but it was already there. Interestingly, at U.S. Ecology, so the issue was really originally discussed within the audit committee, and then over time, it became the audit committee, as often can be the case, became overloaded with all sorts of topics. So it was taking on a lot of these new issues like technology, cyber, ESG, et cetera. And so the decision was made to create a corporate responsibility and risk committee, which I chair, which manages those issues as well as cybersecurity. So it makes it easier to give it sort of the requisite amount of focus because now there's a committee that's ultimately responsible. And I think we're going to start seeing more of that, more of sort of independent, committees, whether they're, permanent or ad hoc. But I think we're going to start seeing that because the issue is just, it's taking on so much importance, particularly with investors, that there's no question. I think that we're going to start seeing more committees. And I recall reading recently, Gartner said that there's going to be, I think there could be somewhere in the realm of 40% of companies having sort of new committees by 2025. So let's see if that happens.
Things are changing. We know that for sure. And I guess I would be remiss on a slight tangent from this, thinking about your first public company board role. You're at U.S. Ecology, and one of your responsibilities, you're on the audit committee. Great. I think it's a wonderful place for people to start, even if you're not a numbers person. That's the best place to learn the business. But you're also chairing a committee, right? So you're chair of the Risk and Corporate Responsibility Committee. In many ways, that might be a huge ask for someone joining the first public company board role, because just becoming a good board member of a public company can be hard. What's it been like for you as a chair, and what's the advice you have for people? I don't think we spend enough time on the show talking about what it's like to be a chair.
Yeah, and it is a learning experience, given that it was my first, public company board role. But that said, so the good news, for at least that helped me, was that I had a lot of experience at PVH with the board. So I reported to, in a number of ways, I reported to the audit committee. And I also reported to the Corporate Responsibility Committee. So I understood sort of the inner workings of how these committees worked. And at U.S. Ecology, I'm also very fortunate because it's the lead director there has been a great mentor and has really helped to assist in terms of how do you chair a committee, how do you build agendas, how do you sort of help gently guide without without, again, stepping over the line, because I think that can be difficult, especially with companies that aren't fully sophisticated in the areas of ESG, right? You might have a tendency to want to say, like, oh, you should do this, this, and this, but you can't. So, you really want to just, sort of gently guide. And I think you can do that to some extent through how you build the agenda, and have access to, to some of the leadership team and work with them to sort of drive forward. And that's really what I've been doing. And it's really been great. So there's only been about maybe 4 meetings so far. It's a fairly new committee, but it's going exceptionally well. And I can already see sort of more sophistication in terms of how it's being run, and in terms of sort of predictability on the agendas, et cetera.
Well, I'd love to pick up on what you were just talking about there, where your lead director has been a wonderful mentor for you. And one thing that has always surprised me about the boardroom is that time and again, I hear about organizations that don't onboard the board members very well. When you think about how much effort most companies spend on onboarding new employees, and how important this is as a role, you spend so much time and money trying to find the right person, and sometimes they're just sort of thrown into things. So it's great that you've had a good experience. What advice would you give to someone else if they land in a board seat and perhaps they're not blessed with that? What should they be asking of the organization, to their board members, to set themselves up to be successful in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I would take a step back and even say, these are the kinds of things you should be vetting from a due diligence perspective during sort of the interview process with the board, because I was also very lucky because I had some great relationships with board members at PVH, and they were also very helpful to me during my board pursuit process, and the lead director at PVH gave me some topics of inquiry for a prospective board member, and they were all very lovely about giving of their time to just be supportive to me. And I think that helped in terms of understanding what you should ask. And I do think that one of the important topics is what is there in terms of the onboarding, what is there in terms of board education, et cetera, because it can take time. It can take at least a year, sometimes longer if the company is complex, to really understand it. If you're sitting on a board, it is not like getting a job where within 3 to 6 months you're just inculcated, right? You're just drinking from a fire hose, and you understand all the ins and outs. As a board member, you meet quarterly, maybe a little more often, but you don't know it as well. So I think that it's helpful to understand what the process is. If you don't have it and you did accept the role, I certainly, and I hope that wouldn't be the case, but I would either go to the lead director or chairman of the board, and maybe there's some documentation that you can ask for. Maybe there's some meetings with some of the senior management, some of the key players that you might want to meet with to just help to better understand the business, et cetera. So there's a couple different things. Obviously, you should be up to date with peers. So I watch I get news feeds about all of the the competitors or peer groups, et cetera. So I've started to do more reading in that space. So you have to also spend a little bit of time just getting as familiar as you can. It's a process, and you have to be committed to it, which is why I think quite a few people gave me advice, and I'm sure you've heard it on this podcast, that it's a commitment to join a board. You should feel passionate about the company and about the industry, because you're going to be spending a fair amount of time having to learn more about it. So it's a little bit on the company, but it's on you too, right? To really understand as best you can the nature of the business.
It's a part-time, full-time job or something along those lines. It takes a lot of time to continue to be a great board member. And just listening to what you're talking about there about the onboarding process and wanting to do it well, it is harder now during COVID. Even if you used to get together face-to-face every quarter, some organizations are structuring that now because of COVID. They're not traveling as much, maybe only meet once or twice in person. And those dinners, the chances to have the informal chats and get to know the board members are so important. It makes it harder to be as effective as you can early today to build those relationships.
So hard. I mean, we have just onboarded our third board member during COVID. So it's just coincidental that there's been board refreshments of late, and there were a number of folks rolling off. And it's not an easy thing to do, because you miss the sort of the social parts. And I've heard some people say that they'll have virtual dinners or cocktail hours or whatever with the board, where you just don't talk about business, just to give an opportunity to converse, right? But it's not the same, but it's something. The other thing that I'm doing, and that others have done, is to reach out. So sort of having one-on-ones with some of the board members in between board meetings. So getting to know each other that way. So one of the the newer board members reached out to me several months ago, and we had a Zoom call and had a nice chat, and it was a great opportunity to just learn more about her and for her to understand a little more about me. So there's things you can do, but I'm certainly looking forward, as I'm sure most board members are, to the time when we can where we can have face to face again and really exchange ideas in person.
No question about that. And, I feel, Melanie, we've barely scratched the surface today of many things that are changing today in the boardroom. We'll have long-lasting implications for the changes associated with that. But I would love to get your sort of final thoughts today when we think about the future of the boardroom. Things are growing and changing so quickly and so fast. From all the sort of stuff we've been talking about today, where do you think the boardroom is headed as it focuses on these topics?
So, in short, I've said this for a long time, that I think this is going to be an era of sustainability, diversity, and digital. And so I think those are going to be critical topics, and we're going to start seeing whether the board members have the big G general experience. We're going to start seeing board members who have those skill sets come in to provide sort of added expertise. You can't really phone it in these areas anymore. I think these are critical topics that boards are going to have to display knowledge of. So for me, I think that's going to be a really big sea change. And then I also think, what we're seeing is, the primacy of the shareholder, the era of the primacy of the shareholder is shifting, and it's really becoming much more corporate purpose, really becoming much more very stakeholder oriented, looking at, other stakeholders, including shareholders, as well as the community in which you work and live. So I think we're really going to start to see a shift in terms of what issues are critical on the agenda. And as a result of that, I think there's going to be a more, or even, if you will, a renewed focus on strategy within the board context. So because all of these changes are coming, there's going to, and we're in this era of volatility, we're going to see a lot more focus, I think, on just strategic imperatives and looking around the corner for sort of future and emerging risks. So it's that is really going to have to improve, because realistically, the thing that's going to keep companies going in this era of extreme volatility is resilience. And resilience has to be from really having a sense of what's on the come. So there's going to have to be much more of a focus on that in the years to come, I would think.
Well, perhaps both exciting and daunting at the same time, but it's never a dull moment in the boardroom. There is so much change that's happening. It seems like it's going faster and faster. And Melanie, we were delighted to have you on the show today and hear about some of your experience and how that's going for you and how you've applied your prior role to make the experience and to add the value into your own board. So congratulations on landing that U.S. Ecology seat. And thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Melanie Steiner. It was insightful to hear how she took her corporate career from being in the C-suite as a chief risk officer, and it is one of the broadest CRO job descriptions I've seen, and how that translated that expertise in risk and ESG and other topics into the boardroom and how she adds value into that space. And of course, we've been living through crazy times during COVID, and ESG, if it wasn't already at the forefront of a company, has moved for a variety of reasons up to the top. So clearly, this is a hot space to be in, and every company seems to talk about it and cover it differently. So it's great to hear about Melanie's firsthand experience. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources. Please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.